33 Lessons. Copyright notice: no part of this publication may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise, without the written permission of the author or publisher. Copyright Jamix Premieres. Lesson 13. You are God. This page has been left blank intentionally. Your notes. Lesson 21. Religious colonization is very real in Africa to date. Believe it or not, I was an altar boy, or more of what we can call an acolyte in proper English, and above all, I made it to a junior seminary for my middle levels, but a time came when I didn't want to go to church myself, and this was not because I hated God, but because I doubted how they purported to bring him to Africa, though I know at the back of my mind he was here already. I honestly didn't like how they used him to brainwash Africans to submission, particularly, and in the struggle for Africa with the objective of taking our lands and enslaving Africa. But to make it worse, nobody saw that as a problem. Have you ever done research of how apartheid succeeded in South Africa? Either way, can we blame God for our own ignorance? I don't think so. Did you know that God works like a search engine, just like Google, especially for those who have attained that status we can call a friend of God, which can be only when one achieves some high levels of humility. Unless you ask the right question, you can never get the relevant answer, though it's equally never wrong. It was thus, and of course the ignorance and to some extent, the corruption of our forefathers, that the Bible was used to oppress Africa, making us believe we had no spirituality, or rather our spirituality was inferior to the West, and that we were not connected to the one true God, though existing evidence show a different detail. There is this story of a spiritual sailor who sunk his ship, and when he cried to God for help, God sent him 8 other ships to assist. Imagine, 1 2 3 8, and he told all the men in every ship that he was waiting on God. When God came, his only question was why he was still disturbing him, while he didn't take all the help he sent. The same character of God is seen in the woman who was waiting for Christ, cleaned her house and her compound, but missed the opportunity 3 times because he came dirty. Therefore, we need to change the current African belief in spirituality and reinvent our religious understanding to view religion in the same lens with culture and politics, for they all affect the spirit. That the kingdom of God is within us, as Christ said, then we need to rethink especially what was brought to Africa as spirituality, that we may be free from these religious colonization and cocoons masquerading as religions at the expense of spirituality. Did you know psychological warfare is bigger than atomic bombs? Psychological war attacks the spirit, compromising the power of the mind. Worse is if you don't see it early enough, you become a slave forever. We will, however, discuss the power of the mind, and then, you can realize what we miss when the mind is captured, and worst of all, there is no way for you to realize it. So, forget even achieving your purpose if you are under such psychological attack. Farther, as it's evident by the principle of fasting and denial for the body, sometimes pain is good for strengthening the mind and the spirit, but psychological pain is extremely perilous, for it has the complete opposite effect, thus always see such schemes in time and avoid them completely. We can thus confidently say that there was no vacuum of spirituality and divinity before the coming of those European missionaries in the name of religions, and so, there was not a vacuum of God in the African societies, and neither was it in other spiritual regions. Did you know that Rome has had 3 African popes before, but none, unfortunately, and I must apologize in advance for such a comparison, but yes, none after the compilation of the final version of the Bible in the early 400s? Whatever happened afterwards, only God knows, but these seems to be the origin of some coordinated effort to suppress the African spirituality. Farther, there exists undisputed evidence to confirm that there were prayers, worship, sacrifice and offerings to God, complete with prophets and priests in the African societies who for whatever reason are not documented at all for any reference. It's even sarcastically said that, in case you need to do scholarly research about the ancient African cultures, religions, or spirituality, you cannot do it effectively from Africa. Rather, just walk into a museum or an old university library in the West and they will definitely have something much better. I know of an African prophetess who prophesied the invention of a pocket fire before the creation of matchboxes as invented in the 1840s. She farther prophesied the coming of the West to Africa, the colonization, and the building of the Great Railway in the prophecy, where she saw a long snake that was spitting fire and smoke moving from waters to waters. She also prophesied the building of skyscrapers even before they were invented in Chicago around 1884, but this great prophetess is documented as a sorcerer and a witch who practiced primitive African religion and rudimentary medicine. Her name is Siokomo. I know all this because I am of the Kamba tribe, and much has been preserved in oral literature, as it is the case in most African communities. The question is, who told them that our God was not found in caves, rocks, valleys, hills, or even the deepest of forests, while they agree that their God could be found under solitude? Where else in Africa would anyone undergo the experience of solitude to find God? It is, however, by some of these findings of God being evident in our African societies that I have never understood why the European missionaries came and destroyed the spiritual fabric of our people if they were sincere, and for sure, a lot of explanation has to be done, especially to me, If I have to buy their narrative, which anyway I will not buy either way. However much this is unbelievable, I know of a seminarian now ordained as a priest in the Catholic Church who was once told to his face by a missionary priest, that priesthood was not for Africans. The missionary farther gave him 100 shillings, an equivalent of maybe 10,000 Kenya shillings today, to go for job hunting in Garissa. Very, very, very unfortunate. I am just wondering how we should know that we were not lied to by such characters in the name of the gospel. Though this story gets more interesting on how God provided comfort for him when the missionary refuses to spend the night in the same house with the black, a mission house to be specific, I would want to leave it at that, for I believe the point is already home. The bottom line is that the African man was already God-fearing, which is unquestionably what we have called humility, and I still think it was easier to inculcate the same Christian values promoted then and same to date over the existing African spirituality. While such rich history of our spirituality is written in people's hearts, minds, oral history, customs, and religious functions, oral literature has the risk of mutation or even getting distinct, and to be sincere, such evidence may go down with the current generation if we are not careful enough, for this is entirely based on oral transmission. These facts serve as one of the motivations that in a university setting up in MWINGI, we have designated the Division of Religious, Cultural, and Political Sciences to document these evidences across Africa before it's too late. Well, I am very passionate about this matter and have taken the time to pull some information together about African religions still in existence today. The Akan and the Bono of Ivory Coast and Ghana, Yoruba of Nigeria and the Sira of Senegal seem to have their religions and beliefs in God still intact. While there are some visible distinctions between the Western African traditional religions and the ones from the Northeastern Africa popularly known as the Horn, we find more similarities in the Southern, Eastern, and Central African beliefs, which often include a supernatural being and a greater prevalence of prophets within the oral culture and religious traditions. Some of these Horn religions are still in existence in some territories of Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and the larger Sudans and Egypt, though the rest of the societies including Morocco, Libya, Algeria among others are largely influenced by the Abrahamic religions. Interestingly, there is an African religion called Vodun that seemed to have survived after being exported to the diaspora by African slaves and still being practiced in territories like Louisiana, Haiti, Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Brazil that seemed to have some greater influence from of the Mbii people inhabiting the ancient West Coast religions in Benin, Togo and Ghana, thus signifying some level of preservation by these slave societies abroad. In conclusion, I do not find any problem with inheriting the good African cultures into the modern religions, for there is a lot of value in culture. Every cultural principle within our cultures prevented or encouraged something for a better society. We can see, for example, some Arab and Jewish cultures being heavily practiced in both Islam and charismatic Christianism, like the hijabs for women, and also practicing adequate clothing, and even without saying more, we can see how such cultures has helped in avoiding the occasion of sexual sins, unlike in modern societies. There was equally such equivalence, or even much more eloquent cultures and beliefs that made the character and the morals of kings, for in Africa, it was believed that while leaders are born leaders, kings are made, and looking at it strategically with an eagle eye, you find a lot of truth in some of these sayings. So, why then throw away such cultures that kept the early African unbeatable if it was not a strategy to weaken the spirit of Africa? Have you ever thought of the reason why the mighty Islamic State never expanded past the strip of Egypt, Morocco, and Libya to the more fertile lands of Africa? Did they not even conquer Jerusalem? Another food for thought. Your notes. Lesson 18. Spirituality is more of a science, not a religion. For us to understand this principle, let's start the conversation with the consistency of God across all ages, which is key to discerning the actions of God versus other principalities. God will be what he was in the beginning, when Adam encountered him, to when Moses encountered him, when he became Christ, and even today, in the throne as the Spirit, his character is that consistent. If he was pleased with something in the beginning of ages, he will still be pleased with the same today. He will do whatever he did when he was disappointed with man, or when he was pleased. Nothing changes. Let's for example refer to the miracles we have seen in the Bible, the Quran, and other religious books, and here we realize that each can be verified, but only by studying the consistency of the character of God. Miracles are in fact more scientific than you might think. While some spiritualists believe that miracles should always be proven scientifically, it's not a must, but this does not weaken the principle that miracles are a science. Sometimes, the miracle may happen in a time when the technology or the innovation to scientifically prove and verify is unavailable. Do you remember the miracle of Israelites crossing the Red Sea during the times of Moses? There was no way at that time to analyze what happened scientifically, but with the technologies available today like thermoscanning and simulation in combination with historical evidence of what happened during that time, science has proven that this was an act within nature, but the timing? Let's comfortably agree that this is the miracle. We can however see that the most consistent characteristic in nearly all the miracles ever documented, either in any religious text or in all historical literature, is that the miracle is activated by the will in man and actualized by God. Notice that on both the sides of the sea, Moses had to stretch his hand over the waters in order to activate God's action, which now takes me straight to the discussion on the spirituality in the science of faith. We can hereby say that miracles are undoubtedly the conspiracy between the will in man and the faith in the mind, though we will definitely discuss the mind in a lesson coming up for context in this concept. Thus, faith entails verbalizing your will, and it happens. In a more spiritually controversial illustration, faith is practically telling God to do what you want, and he does exactly that or something not far from what you wanted, but will always serve the same purpose in a more perfected way. This concept is powered by the fact that God will always know the outcome of everything you request, especially in faith, though there is still an active debate of whether he already knows what you will request, and this is unexpectedly due to another discussion we will also have later on the impact of the corruption of the system as designed, by the introduction of the will. Many scriptures however distinct that faith without deed is dead, so in faith, prayers must be followed by actual actions through natural cause, whether in the human or the spiritual realm. I have this feeling that you now want to ask me whether the spiritual realm is part of nature, thus I will confidently return a yes and also educate you that the spiritual realm obey the laws of nature faithfully and can even act on your request, as per your words without farther reference. I however have to farther educate you here, that it's advisable for you to follow your prayers with actions in the human realm for the purpose of strategically placing yourself in the path of grace. Anytime you ask God to do what you want in faith, you are practicing your will against the natural course of events as set by God during creation, or rather, you are asking God to correct the natural course of events altered by another person's will in faith, for those who know the power of the will in the human realm will certainly take advantage. Just believe, ask, and it's done. You just need to go and pick. It's as simple as that, as long as you are in the state or a position of grace. These principles of the will, prayer, faith, and some of the other factors of the spiritual realm have however been discussed intensively in other lessons herein, or in the other books I have written for your reference if need be. I am however to the opinion that it would be wise for us to move to another principle of the science of spirituality, which would now be in subjects of tithe, thanksgiving, sacrifice and offering. When you tithe, all you have is protected according to the science of God. Remember that tithing, sacrifice, and thanksgiving are different concepts in spirituality. Tithe is set at 10% of new wealth, or what we can simply call the profits from the sweat of the body, and the main purpose is the spiritual protection and the well-being of the wealth including people, while sacrifice and offering is given to ask for favors from God, and when these favors are granted, because it's not a must that they are granted, a thanksgiving is done. It's thus important to note that the only spiritual method to increase your wealth is by sacrifice and thanksgiving, not tithing, and that's another proven science. And now finally, always choose the altars you go to, especially when giving a sacrifice, with a lot of wisdom, for it is also proven that you only connect to an altar by someone else's faith, and not yours. This is again brought to life by the principle of inheritance, especially by the faith of what we call spiritual parents, but it has equally been proven that it's only by offering sacrifices that such a connection is cemented. Remember, anything you sow naturally, if all factors remain constant, will multiply, and it's unfortunately equally true when dealing with the spiritual realms, and if you are sowing in evil, that remains one of the most complicated and a difficult spiritual process ever. And now finally, very finally for real, know that for anyone to disconnect from an altar they sacrificed in is almost spiritually impossible. Your notes. Lesson 14. Humility attracts definite grace. So, how do you attain this position of grace we keep on talking about? There are several ways, but the greatest of all is humility. Realize that humility is not an emotion, nor a feeling, but a rank that the body achieves at some point in life, and very few ever attain this status, after which they can be trusted with some godly functions in the kingdom. There is this school of thought that believe this is how Emmanuel became Christ, though I must register my strong disagreement with them early enough. I however agree that with big amounts of grace, humility, sacrifice, dedication, and concentration you can achieve Christ today, but this is because it was done then, opening the doors for anyone who chooses to be. Farther, do you know scriptures say, where 2 or 3 are assembled in my name, I am? That's how the completeness of the God in us happens, so humility before one another is humility before God. Even in marriage, this is the principle that is invoked, though you do not become two in the marriage but remain only one. Thus, you can never be God on your own, you have to join and agree to belong. In fact, in the science of the completeness of God, we do not have two, that the next completeness would be 3. Other states of these completeness are with 7, 9, 12, and 24, 33 and of course 40 as the ultimate completeness. Fascinatingly, in yet another proof that spirituality is more of a science than its presumed religious, 7 is driven from the extra 2 completeness in 3, plus the one who led the first completeness, while 9 is achieved when the one who leads the 7 form another completeness of 3. 12 which doubles to form 24, and it is achieved when the new completeness in 9 divides to form a new 3, while the remaining 2 completeness doubles up. You can notice that up to the state of completeness in 9, multiplication is achieved by division, while the rest of the completeness starts to multiply by teaming up. Do you remember anything else that multiplies by division? The point I am trying to bring home here is, When two or more people agree, especially on a spiritual matter when under sufficient grace, God will also put his own stamp on the matter and on the divergent. If we are on a spiritual fight, we lose the grace of God and God will therefore be silent. Silent not because he can do nothing about it, but because his science dictates that there is a day called the Day of Judgment. Your notes. Lesson 19. Don't be religious, be spiritual. I know how matters of faith are deeply personal and divisive, but I also know that the way to heaven is not in churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, shrines, or any other places of worship. In fact, religion is the biggest enemy against humanity, for it has been used to divide us and all for the benefit of man, not God. Different religions imply different characteristics, instances, and forms of God, which is not the case as we have seen in the discussion of the consistency of God. While they all agree that God is one, they seem not to agree on which character of God is God based on how each of them has experienced God, forgetting the fact that God shows himself based on the circumstances and only his character remains the same. In fact, I was just asking myself whether it could have been the death of Christ, and the subsequent coming of the Holy Spirit to earth that opened the divinity of God to other societies apart from Israel, and then I read this. After the death of the kingdom of Israel under Babylon, there is in fact historical evidence of some spirituality and divinity in other regions of the world other than in the chosen people of Israel. From the shrines in Africa to the Confucius and the Tao in China, the Shinto in Japan, and the Buddha in India, plus many more philosophies emerged all of a sudden after 600 BCE, though most of them were based on karma, which can be quickly explained as the desire for good or that good deed, which apparently causes good things happening back and vice versa in case of bad and evil. I can however comfortably say this was validated by Christ himself when he explained the law of love. It's important to note at this point that no evil survives for such a long time, and for these philosophies to survive for such a long time cannot be evil, for all evil has a very effective date of death. A detailed analysis reveals that religions initiate from philosophies that are a true character of God, thus stand the test of time under different cosmic orders. Let's thus look into some of the philosophies, starting with Hinduism, which is one of the oldest philosophies and influenced religions like Sikhism, Jainism, Ayurveda, and Buddhism. The ancient monotheist Israelite religion also influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Zoroastrianism in turn influenced different Greek philosophies, hence religions evolve over time, but the principle of spirituality remains constant. It's hereby important to note this transition from most early religions, which we have said were based on karma, to the later monotheistic religions which have focused upon the belief in one God, the Creator who loves us all. Thus there is no need to fight on which one God is one God, it's just one God and we are all one. To start with here, let's first focus on the Buddhists, who have almost the same philosophies as the Hindus, for Hinduism gave birth to Buddhism by the fact that the Buddha was a Hindu who would seek self-enlightenment in 600 BCE, creating the Buddhist philosophy. It's believed that the Buddha, who was a Hindu prince, lived a good luxurious life before going out of the palace one day, and saw an old man, a sick man and a dead man. Because he had never seen such suffering, he inquired from the servants he was with, and they told him that everyone will someday experience old age, sickness, and even death, including himself. This was like his turning point to study human suffering by self and thereafter becoming a monk. Buddhism is currently practiced across the world but resident more in China, India, and the larger Asia. However, there is a new crop of Buddhism influenced by both Islam and Christianity, as introduced by the Islamic State in the 1500 CE. Farther, the Confucius philosophy created a system of 5 humanity relationships based on the seniority in the society and in the foundation of the family. Here, you should only do to others what you wish would be done to yourself, or in simpler words, benevolence. Zhuangzhou, also a Chinese philosopher around the time of Confucius, believed that inaction towards nature was the key to self-enlightenment by letting nature take its cause, and this philosophy forms the basis for Taoism. Jainism is also a popular religion and focuses on faith, knowledge, and behavior modeling, while Sikhism consists of those who are learners of the way of God. All these are subsets of Dharmic philosophy focusing on self-enlightenment, karma, or rather, freeing your soul. Shinto, Falun Gong, Rastafari, Baha'i, and Wicca are also religious movements on the rise in different parts of the world today. Farther, in analyzing the religious philosophies and their sources, Islam is submission to God, or rather finding peace of mind in God, which I don't find being a bad idea at all. It's said that Angel Gabriel, visited Muhammad, a descendant of Abraham in the bloodline of Ishmael and an orphan born and living in Mecca, today's Arabia, while he was praying in the cave alone. Though unlearned, Gabriel taught Muhammad the narration of the Quran in 1 month, which is today celebrated as the month of Ramadan. Farther, he desired to improve and relieve the lives of his people from the visible poverty, war, injustice, and discrimination by the authorities, with the first converts to Islam being black slaves oppressed by their masters. After 10 years, Muhammad fled to Medina in 622 CE to avoid being killed for his message of the equity of humanity, but later, by the order of God, came back to Mecca, being the king of Medina, with the message that the converts who were being killed can defend themselves against the Quraysh, or rather the rulers. The ground rules for the defense were set to 1. No forceful conversion to Islam. Other rules included no harming the environment, farms, trees, animals, or herds, no targeting public places, children, unarmed or the disabled, and to be kind to prisoners, which we see is very consistent with the character of God we have so far seen in previous lessons. He started a crusade to convert all to Islam till his demise in 632 CE, after which the archangel Michael showed him the way to heaven. Although by the time of the death of Muhammad the Quran was not written, but passed down orally through generations and generations, it was compiled in the tail end of the 700 CE, almost 200 years after his death, and for long, it has been preserved in Arabic, though there are efforts to translate it to other languages recently. We should also, in a good faith, agree that oral preservations are prone to mutations, hence there is no guarantee that the Quran being translated today is the exact original message by God through Angel Gabriel, for it's common knowledge that before the king of the Islamic State ordered the compilation of one Quran, there existed several variations that he had to order burned. Do I see history repeating itself here, that we have several versions, even for the Bible, that vary extremely due to various languages and translations? Finally, for Islam, we cannot end the discussion without mentioning the controversial philosophies in the teaching of Islam that are not in the Quran itself, like women and hijabs, halal and fiqh, jihad and the Sharia laws. Thus this should be taken as either Arab culture or personal experiences of the various Islamic kings, kingdoms, and scholars who came after Muhammad. Did you know that the Shahada itself, or the statement of faith, is not even in the Quran in its totality? Going forward, in the review of Judaism, and by the account of the Tanakh, God created everything, the universe, including the cosmos, and especially more science was applied when he took soil and molded man in this context, Adam and Eve, who were influenced to sin and were thrown out of the garden. Fast forward, God destroys the world but saves Noah, the ninth descendant of Adam, and his three sons Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, which in turn saves humanity. This interestingly happened 2,000 years after the creation, as proven by scriptures, historic and scientific records. Later, God chooses Abraham to start the reconciliatory journey with humanity, and he moves from Ur, which becomes Babylon afterwards, today being the modern Iraq, to Canaan, today's modern Israel near Egypt, which was the global superpower at that time. He was a descendant of Shem the son of Noah, and initially had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, but later gets more children after the death of Sarah. His covenant with God is inherited by Isaac, who had two sons, Esau and Jacob, who interestingly are remembered for fighting over a birthright. Jacob farther actualizes the covenant, as he was later named Israel after winning a battle against an unnamed angel. The children of Jacob, now renamed to Israel, would then go to Egypt and survive a bad global famine with him, but he dies there. There is in fact scientific and archaeological evidence of this global famine that wiped out all Bronze Age history and civilization across the world that to date makes it difficult to document anything pre-Bronze Age. Later, Jacob's descendants are enslaved after the deaths of Joseph, the son of Jacob, who was sold as a slave by his own brothers, but God instead rose him to the level of the governor of Egypt, the global superpower at that time. Well, slavery was not immediate, but let's keep that story for another day. Fast forward, an Israelite named Moses, the son of Amram and the great-grandson of Levi, the oldest son of Jacob, is tasked with liberating the Israelites and taking them back to their promised land, Canaan. We also note that for quite some time, God was by himself the king of Israel, directing what to be done through one person, but at a point Israelites rebelled, and God gave them judges and priests to rule, after which they again rebelled and were given human kings, as they asked. These kings were to be checked closely by an authority of God known as prophets, the first being Saul in the era of Prophet Samuel, the second David, and the last being King Solomon, who we see in other antique biopics had a son with an Ethiopian queen, the Queen of Sheba. This is very important for context, because while we toil and strive looking for the Ark of the Covenant, it is documented that Solomon gave the Ark to the son for safekeeping in Ethiopia, and it's assumed that that's where it resides to date. The question here remains, did Solomon know that Israel will be conquered, and the temple destroyed? While we cannot rule that out, it could also be the reason why the kingdom successfully split and never to unite again, maybe because they no longer held the symbol of unity and the authority of God. Could this also be the reason why Ethiopia was never colonized? Anyway, let's leave this for another forum. All in all, the kingship under Solomon scrambled on the greed to divide Israel farther after his death, with the initial two kingdoms being Judah, housing only 2 tribes, and Israel, which housed 10 of the 12 tribes. The kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians, and the 10 tribes were dispersed to only God knows where, thus today referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel, and later Judah was conquered by the Babylonians, now modern-day Iraq, until the Persian kingdom led by Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and freed the Jews back home in Judah. However, Babylon, historically being their ancestral home, was still home, that it was the original home of Abraham before he met God. The Romans farther conquered the world and colonized a better part of the world, including Judah, until the birth of Christ in around 3 BCE. Does this story look familiar to Christians and Muslims? Yes, This is because these religions including Judaism was influenced by the ancient Israelite philosophy as we said earlier in this lesson, and when Christ was rejected by Jews, as whether a prophet, a king, a savior, or the God he had come as saw the creation of a fall-away Jewish sect, later casually referred as Christianity, and which by extension or association believed to have influenced the Islam faith that gave Jesus a very high status in the kingdom, but denied that he ever died. For me, although this is also those of the very, very personal of my opinions, I would not fight this faith, for I know it is written that Christ was left to partake the cup, alone. From the point he was strengthened by an unnamed angel after requesting the cup to be taken away. Let's thus agree that heaven left, for Christ to partake the cup alone during the duration he calls the hour of darkness, and that it included angels, and including the angel, Gabriel. I have read the Quran severally and it's more of a testimony of the angel, and Gabriel being a trusted angel, he would only testify to what he saw. Allow me to get a bit flouting on this, for it's common knowledge that during the compiling of the Bible by the Council of Rome in 332 CE and preceding councils, things got a bit, if not evidently much messy. While most of the Old Testament existed before Christ, a lot was left out in the final versions of the Bible. The same happened to the New Testament, which was written some 60 to 100 years after the death of Christ. Whether the subtraction of powerful text by authors who had a direct interaction with the Christ himself was a Roman political decision or not, the Red Sea Scrolls have proven it happened. Farther, the statement that nothing is to be added takes away that right to add anything, while for the Gospels alone, it is said that what Christ did could not even fit in the whole world if all is written. Looking at the consistency of the character of God, could these deductions fuel heavens to send angel Gabriel, who is interestingly branded as the messenger in all scriptures, to come down to earth to correct some of the reductions? That now brings back this question whether the rejection of Christ by the chosen people of Israel opened up the grace and the divinity of God to the rest of the humanity, even for those who were not in the list of the descendants of Abraham. Although we can never downplay the role of Israel in the preservation of the New Testament and the Old Testament eras, was it just a preparation by God to reach all humanity? And if it was this not an enormous planning, having taken another period of 2,000 years after the flood, and could this be another coincidence? Your notes. Lesson 12. God responds to grace, not prayer. Grace is the only concept that multiplies by division. The principle is when you give, you are not left with less but with more than what you in fact gave. Grace is also unfortunately the most misunderstood concept by man. Let me use this example. I have read from a Vatican letter, that the Pope has allowed Catholic priests to bless couples from same-sex marriages and the criticism thereafter. Reading from the critics, they already were the judges to the purported sin, but as we will see, it's not up to them. Blessing the couples does not mean the priest approves of the marriage, it simply requests God's grace in the spirits of this people, though by scripture, they might not deserve God's presence, for grace can be two-way in that, 1. You might not be worthy the favor of God but he still waves, or 2. You have been very obedient to his laws that you deserve everything, and that's what we will refer to when we talk of a friend of God. We also say that in all situations, God is there, and yes, that's very true, but would heavens respond even when you are not in a position of grace? No way. Someone said that God only helps those who help themselves, and I partially agree with them. God can even respond in self to the prayer of a person who is in the position of grace, and if you are making prayers to God in need of some favors, then that's the secret. Realize above, that I have used the term favors because contrary to what most religious sects believe, everything that is due to you whether you pray for it or not will come automatically. For example, if you are in the list of those who will use oxygen today, it will be supplied, and you will be alive whether you pray for it or not. Though this is not to discourage you from praying without ceasing, it's only that we have all sorts of laws of nature that react to different occurrences even without God's intervention, for it's a basic character of God to set the ball rolling and thereafter, letting nature take its course. Okay, this is the point here. You do not deserve to die because you are not in a state of grace, but you deserve not to die because you are in a position of grace. I hope that makes sense now. Also know that sometimes God can be silent, and it doesn't mean you are not in the state or position of grace. He even went silent on himself, and this is evident when Christ said, my Lord, why have you forsaken me?" There is this story that our Sunday school teacher used to tell us about a man who faithfully walked with God, and he noticed by looking back at his footsteps that when he was in trouble and going through difficulties, a second pair of the footsteps that accompanied him always disappeared. He knew that the second pair was God's walking with him, so he one day asked him why he left when he was experiencing difficulties. Then he told him that the footsteps he sees during difficulties is actually his, for God carries him in the times that he cannot make it through. So yes, he can be silent but still with you, silent especially for those who have not yet grown spiritually to attain the status of the friend of God. There are many reasons for the silence of God, even though the main would undeniably be timing. God will always give you what you need, but in what you want, he will only do when he is convinced you can handle it unless you invoke your will, after which you will be on your own on that matter. God can also be silent on your prayer if it has already been answered. He has different ways of answering prayers, hence it's important to understand when your prayer is answered, and it must not be how you wanted it to be answered. You may pray for strength, and God will give you difficulties to make you strong, for wisdom, and He gives you enough problems to solve. If you prayed for courage, He may put you into dangers for you to overcome, and for love, He might put into your life difficult people. And now you ask Him to remove them. No. That's not how things work in the spiritual world. He will be silent, in fact very silent, until you learn how to love them. The other very obvious reason would be, when someone somewhere is using their will against you for some justice of an injustice done by either you, or that your forefathers were involved in, if you have not yet disconnected yourself. We will talk about this conclusively later, but allow me to emphasize on one thing: always do what's right to others, simply because when someone has something against you before God, however much heavens may want to help, He will be silent, and again, this is due to the will. As long as it's not delaying God's work or what we call kingdom agenda, we can wait. Kingdom agenda basically refers to the events that will influence the end of time or the beginning of a new world order. To put this into context, let me give some examples here, even though I am not sure if this is the best example for this scenario, but let me. A curse by a parent can keep a child's blessing at limbo, whether heavens should grant or not, or even wait. There are 3 types of such curses that will automatically result to the silence of God. The rest is negotiable by disconnection, repentance, or invoking of the will. We have seen one of these is when a parent is unhappy with a child, whether justly or unjustly, God will be silent. I have added unjustly simply because it's from the seed we acquire the body, which either way, will be the biggest beneficiary of every worldly blessing, or rather in simpler terms, what we can call rewards for the body. The second is a curse by the child, but this requires some level of spiritual justification. For example, if a child slept hungry while you can afford food for them, their tears and the cry for justice will catch up with whoever is in the middle of the crisis. We will later learn this lesson, that a seed is cursed from the source, and yes, believe it or not, a curse by one child will automatically hold the blessing of other siblings from the seed. And finally, the third curse, which is even far much worse than any other. You can be the reason why God is silent on you, so be careful. Your notes. Lesson 30. Know Satan when you see him in self. Anytime Satan wants to deal with me thoroughly, he always takes me to the old town of Constantinople, hence I have come to this conclusion that he might have his HQ in Turkey. Just another assumption, of course with no intention to offend the Republic of Turkey, but maybe, and kindly just take this as another maybe, like God decided to make earth his home by the birth of Emmanuel, the death of Christ and the coming of the Spirit, the portal Satan used to access heaven was equally closed, thus he had to make some home somewhere on earth. Anyway, that's the only logical enough explanation as to why, but let me just continue, now on a serious note. Anytime I find myself there, even if it's in a dream, I prepare myself in the spirit, for I know for sure, the body is about to be beaten bad, and worst, the ones I love are about to see dust, as we say in Africa. He. You now know you need to be careful, especially if you are in the list of the ones I love. That said, allow me to just be ethical enough to declare some interests at this point. Of all the 33 lessons, this will be my favorite, and yes, I know Satan in person because I have come face to face with evil, severally. In fact, I don't like it when people use the term devil, and name Satan interchangeably, for that is like calling a spade a big spoon instead of simply a spade. A devil in very simple terms is the personification of evil. Do you remember we said in an earlier lesson that you can be the reason why God gets silent on your prayer? In such a case, you become the devil to yourself. On the other hand, Satan is a being, Lucifer the angel of God, the morning star, the son of the dawn, while you have to understand that he still holds all the powers he held before he became Satan, and will still hold them, until the day he will be judged. Again here, let's agree that Satan is not yet judged, and that God did not cast him out of heaven. It was the archangel Michael and his armies after he was defeated in the great war, hence, for now he is simply a fallen angel, the accuser of man, and of course, the prince of darkness. Have you ever wondered why Satan would cause man to sin against God, then rush to God in heaven to accuse him of the same sin he influenced? Here, I can only rush to the Quran for reference. Are you also surprised that Satan goes to heaven? Yes, he can, like he did in the story of Job. Scriptures read that, there was a day the sons of God presented themselves in heaven, and Satan came among them. So, if you want to know Satan when you see him, start by brushing off all the ignorance and delete away any wrong assumptions that you already have on who he is. In fact, delete everything, let's instead start a blank page. On the blank, I want to start with emphasizing that Satan has no free will, and interestingly, while his basic mission is to offend God, he himself does not want to do anything that would result to God's anger on him because he knows the consequences. See, for the case of Job, he had to request God to deal with Job, because Job understood his power over him. Do you know that after creation, man was given power over the earth and anything in it, thus all things, Living and non-living or even pre- and post-living should do and be according to the will of man when on earth, including Satan and all the fallen angels and demons if and when they are on earth. He. Not so fast. Do not mistake this statement to underestimate the power of Satan. For one, he has been on earth long enough to master deception and the tricks to survive, suppress, and manipulate the will of man. In fact, I once asked him how old he was and he laughed, saying he was older than me. Secondly, he is an angel, and a very powerful angel in the kingdom, and as we will learn in the next lesson, God does not take away any powers he has given to anyone or anything, even after they fall apart. But importantly, know that Satan also has the right to scripture, including the Bible, and he can quote it to fool the fools who don't know him. So, how do you know Satan when you see him? First, anything that have this feeling of fear, not freedom, is most likely a deception of Satan, for fear is the greatest of all weapons that Satan uses to keep man out of his purpose. Fear intimidates and will always come before desperation, shame, guilt, and finally anger, among other emotions that eats into the inner man while evil fills the space left in. All over sudden, this will graduate to pride, which unfortunately, you might mistake for confidence, and then to greed, which now in turn, will fragment the soul, leaving man at the mercy of Satan, if he has any at all. Thus, anytime you find yourself in such a confusion, then the most obvious defense is momentum, for Satan hates momentum. Keep moving to your purpose, even if it's in baby steps, someone will definitely come to your aid. Secondly, adapt praise and worship as a method of prayer to cure the pride in the body first, for Satan can never let you pray. Finally, you must share your genuine sweat in sacrifice and in offering, to cure the greed. While momentum and pride have a spiritual solution, greed doesn't, and can only be dealt with in the physical, or rather what we can call the human realm. Do you remember the lesson that we learned before, that when you sink you can never float yourself? Yes. You can never, and you have to get help from someone else who is under some sufficient grace. Although this doesn't mean if he succeeds to kill you, you will go to hell, but don't celebrate yet. What this means is that he has succeeded in stopping you from your purpose, which you will still answer for. Your notes. Lesson 31. The powers of the gifts are irrevocable. If you have faith, you will perform miracles, healing, prophecy, etc. If you have wisdom, you will do wonders beyond human understanding. If you have piety and fortitude, people will never understand why you thrive even in a season of drought or dry spell, and many, very many other examples that I can give, but let's not confuse the gifts to the fruits. I will therefore try to explain the gifts in the simplest way possible. Gifts are a reward following the obedience of the body to the spirit, and I presume that this is the main reason why they can never be taken away. It's technically a reward to the body on earth, where you are allowed to use the will on your judgment to act on behalf of God in the spiritual realm without incriminating the soul. Have you been wondering why God lets servants who have fallen to continue performing miracles if they want to, and still in His name? The answer is simple: once an asset in the kingdom is always an asset, despite their shortcomings. I have used the example of Moses in this book a lot, and I will use him here again, maybe for the last time. Moses had a problem with anger, which always led him to a sin against God, or rather what Paul refers as the thorn in the flesh, which thus warranted God to strike him dead there and then, considering and going by the rules of interaction at the time. But every time Moses went back to God, he was forgiven to continue serving under the same gifts or even more. Let me just think loud here that we said that this is the last time we will use Moses as an example in this book. Did Moses really test death? Remember when Christ met these two men, Moses and Elijah, during the Transfiguration? Though no one would want to add Moses in the list, I would confidently do, for he was also there with Christ. While it's assumed that he died and God buried him, no one saw his body. There was a time when Satan himself looked for the body of Moses unsuccessfully. What if God just took him? Only he knows, and if he had died as assumed, what was he doing in the land of the living with Christ? That's not how things work in the kingdom. Anyway, let's just agree that Christ was with the men who never died for the sake of saving some time. Moving on, it's equally also important to know that gifts are so many, that some have not even been documented, unlike the fruits. And finally, understand that gifts are interrelated in that 2 or 3 have to work together for a mission to be successful, and are also inheritable by the will of the inheritor. Remember how Elisha inherited the gifts from Elijah and surprisingly, even did more with them than Elijah had achieved in his lifetime. Your notes. About this book. This book is a creative theory detailing personal, interpersonal, and divine relationships with a broad discussion of the various divisions contributing to humanity, while obtaining a direction to proving divinity in the science of spirituality, and serves as the basic philosophy for the establishment of the division of religious, cultural, and political sciences of the MWINGI City University. It is designed in 35 distinct lessons from personal encounters and life experiences of the author. The author is from a technical background, thus has focused only on what practically works, excluding theories that has not been tested yet. The lessons are in golden titling, for it's golden if practiced, while the text color is significant and very carefully chosen, to green. Though the author is of a charismatic Catholic upbringing, this book does not endorse any scripture, rather weighs on the spirit of service to humanity as the basic philosophy and the spiritual connection to the one God. The next series in the omnibus. The omnibus is of several books entitled Divinity in Human Spirituality. It consists of 33 lessons, Anatomy of the Soul, the Eighth Spirit, which includes the series From Emmanuel to Christ, and importantly a Christian perspective of the Quran among other religious scriptures. The Anatomy of the Soul discusses the soul and the spirit, the mind, the will, the heart, the body, as well as the relationship between the science of God versus the sciences of humanity. It promotes the concept of one mind into the many brain networks available in humanity, and it's based on the different philosophies of theology. The book is divided in 7 sections, though each chapter is connected to the next, thus strongly interrelated. The Anatomy of the Soul is part of an omnibus that seeks to prove the theories of divinity in human spirituality, with the first series being 33 lessons. It can however comfortably qualify to be lesson number 34. The Eighth Spirit can be viewed as lesson number 35.